Our opening text this morning comes from the book of Matthew, chapter 15, and verse 1 and 2. Matthew 15, verses 1 and 2. Reading from the King James, the Bible says, "Then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees, which were of Jerusalem, saying, Why do thy disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread." The title of today's message is Man's Rules or God's Rules, and I'll turn the time now over to Brother Kevin Wahl.
This morning's sermon, as Kenny mentioned, is entitled Man's Rules or God's Rules. And we're going to, today's sermon will be a simple Bible reading from the Gospels. We'll be turning to Matthew, then Luke, then Mark. And let us start with Matthew. Let's turn to Matthew 15. Matthew 15, starting with verse 1. It reads, verses 1 and 2, "Then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees, which were of Jerusalem, saying, Why do thy disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread." Let's stop there for a minute. So, we read that Jesus' disciples were eating bread, and they didn't wash their hands. Now, we today, not all the time, but very often, wash our hands before eating. It's a good custom. Why do we do it? We do it for hygiene. I'll talk about what the Jewish leaders were really interested in when we read the Mark account of the same story. But we all have occasions where we eat without having washed our hands. Say you're traveling, or say you're at a park somewhere having a picnic. You might not have access to a sink. So sometimes we do eat with, as the King James Version says, unwashen hands. Let us continue. Verse 3. "But he answered and said unto them, Why do ye also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? For God commanded, saying, Honor thy father and mother, and he that curseth father or mother, let him die the death." So, Jesus there quoted the fifth commandment, to honor your father and mother. And evidently, if you cursed your parents, you were executed for it. Can you imagine how many people in our society would be executed if people were executed today for cursing their parents? Let us continue. Pardon me. Jesus says in verse 5, "But ye say, whosoever shall say to his father or his mother, It is a gift." In other words, you give them a gift. "By whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me." In other words, you give them a gift to avoid the penalty. "And honor not his father or his mother, he shall be free. Thus have ye made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition." Let me just say, in other words, the Jewish leaders were making provision for one to break one of God's own rules, one of God's own commandments. But yet they were making their tradition of eating with your hands washed is more important to them. Let us continue. Verse 7, "Ye hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, This people draweth nigh unto me with their mouth, and honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. And he called the multitude and said unto them, Hear and understand. Not that which goeth into the mouth defileth a man, but that which cometh out of the mouth, this defileth a man. Now let's remember what was going into the mouth in that chapter. Bread eaten with unwashed hands. That's what was going into the mouth. Verse 12, Then came his disciples and said unto him, Knowest thou that the Pharisees were offended after they heard this saying? This shows us, friends, how much the disciples the disciples, like the other people in Israel, were indoctrinated by the teachings of the Jewish leaders of their time. And this is how important they considered the Jewish leaders' teachings to be. They mentioned that they were offended. Continuing, verse 13. But he answered and said, Every plant which my heavenly Father hath not planted shall be rooted up. He's speaking about people. Let them alone. They be blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch. Then answered Peter and said unto him, Declare unto us this parable. And Jesus said, Are ye also without understanding? Do ye not understand that that whatsoever entereth in at the mouth goeth into the belly and is cast out into the draught? But those things which proceed out of the mouth come forth from the heart. Remember, out of what? The abundance of the heart, the what? Exactly. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh. Continuing, verse 19. Actually, let me start over at verse 18. But those things which proceed out of the mouth come forth from the heart, and they defile the man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. Friends, remember what we're told in God's word. He that hateth his brother is what? A murderer. It says that murders come out of the heart. Again, verse 19, For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands defileth not a man. So friends, if you ever have an occasion where you're not eating with your hands washed, rest assured, Jesus says that's not going to defile you. Let us turn now to Matthew 23. And we'll read verse 23. Matthew chapter 23, verse 23. Matthew 23, verse 23. Jesus says, Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. So in other words, it was very important to the Jewish leaders to pay tithe. But they omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. Most of the time, when we talk about the weightier matters of the law, we use the wording from this particular verse. Matthew 23, verse 23, judgment, mercy, and faith. I want to mention one more item. Let's turn to Luke 11, verse 42. After this, we'll be going to Mark in a little while. Luke 11, 42. here Jesus says in a similar statement, "But woe unto you, Pharisees, for ye tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs, and pass over judgment." And what else does it say? "The love of God. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone." Before we read the Mark account of the story we read in Matthew, I'm going to share with you a few short stories, things that happened in my own life. Well, the first part is something that I heard about. One day I was talking to a friend of mine. His name also is Kevin. Just so you know, I'm not referring to Brother Wagner, but this was another Kevin. And Kevin told me the story of, I think he was at a camp meeting. He told me about, we'll just go by that, a camp meeting. He was at a camp meeting, and a man was supposed to go up front on the platform. But, I don't know what the man was supposed to do. I don't know if he was going to do a Bible reading, offer a prayer, whatever it was he was going to do. He ended up being asked not to go up front. Why not? He didn't have his suit, coat, and tie on. Well, I don't know if the fellow had a tie on, but there was a reason he didn't have a suit coat on. It was about 90 degrees. And I don't know how the rest of the gentlemen here feel, but I do consider it very uncomfortable to be in 90 degrees wearing my suit coat. Nonetheless, the man was asked not to do what he was going to do because he didn't have his suit coat, the whole ensemble, the suit, coat, and tie. He didn't have all that stuff on. I'm just using that as an example of how sometimes things get done a certain way, and the way things are done becomes very important to people. Now, I used to go to a church in New York. Just so you know, I'm not referring to the Brockton church. Brockton is my hometown. But this other church had one good quality. This other church I used to attend. There was no air conditioning in the building. Now, that's not the good quality I'm referring to. It had no air conditioning. So, during the hot time of the year, they were flexible. You were not expected to wear your suit coat because it was so hot in there, and you could wear a short sleeve shirt. The leaders would wear short sleeve collared shirts and ties, which was much more practical in a place without air conditioning during the summertime. However, this church did have something else, though, that I disagreed with. Now, the first part is no problem. During their song services, they would use their piano. But whenever they had worship service, they would always use their organ. And there was a young lady there having to learn to play the organ. She was better with the piano, but she was having to learn to play the organ because the church wanted the organ played during the worship service. One of their members, after worship service was over, one of their members would talk to me privately. He didn't say anything to the young lady, but he would be speaking to me, and he would criticize her. He would mention what a bad job she did playing that organ. Figuratively speaking, I used to say that he would give her a black eye. And my thought was, well, in that case, why don't you let her play the piano instead? One time I asked that same church member, do you think that if you make any changes in your worship routine, say you sing a different introit, say you use the piano instead of the organ, do you think that will cost you your salvation? Friends, this really happened. The fellow looked me in the eye and said, I don't know. Friends, it can get to that point where when things are done a certain way, in your mind, those things can become rules. They might even become salvific in a person's mind. Of course, I believe we all agree here that if you're in a building without air conditioning, again, this wasn't a problem, but okay, it's not going to cost you your salvation if it's hot and therefore you're not wearing your suit coat. If you have a musician who's better at the piano than an organ, then it won't cost you your salvation to use the piano instead of the organ. Now, I'm sure some of you, when growing up, might remember what was considered the proper way of setting a table. I remember when I took home economics in school, in middle school. Now, just so you know, I went through public school all the way, K to 12, Brockton Central School. My home economics teacher said to us, I know that restaurants take the silverware and wrap it all up with a napkin, but you're going to learn the proper way to do it. Now, some of you might remember, okay, you have your dinner plate. You have, on this side, your fork. On this side, your knife with your blade facing the plate. And then you have your spoon over here. Did I get it right, Miss Perry? Thank you. So, now, let's fast forward. Much later in my life, I used to live with a couple, not to mention any names. And the wife was very insistent on setting the table that way. I did cooperate. There was nothing wrong with it. But yes, not only was she insistent on setting the table a certain way, but when it came time to serve food, I'm sure all of us have served food from a kettle before. But this woman was very insistent that you needed to take the kettle and transfer the food from a kettle to a bowl. It always had to be done that way. Again, I did cooperate. There was nothing wrong with what she wanted to do. But talk about having a certain way of doing things all the time. And I'm sure for some people, some people may consider that impractical or annoying. It was extra work, I will say that much. But I remember one time here in Virginia, not in this area, just so you know, not in this area, I was speaking at a church. I can't remember if it was when I was a student at Heartland College or during my first time as a staff member there. It was one or the other. I think it was during my first time as a staff member there. I was wearing a suit coat, and I had the whole suit coat buttoned up. And after the service was over, one of the gentlemen there told me that whenever you wear a suit coat, you're supposed to keep the bottom button undone. Now, I know many of you, I'm sure many of you know that's a common custom in our society. I've never confirmed this, but one of my brothers told me the reason for that is when people would sit down during meetings. That way the suit coat, it wouldn't be, I'm trying to think of how to word this. That way the suit coat could, just comfortably, it wouldn't be too tight on the person while they're sitting. But again, I've never confirmed that as being the reason how that practice started. But again, I did cooperate. Eventually, I started doing that. I would wear my suit coat with the bottom button undone. And I wanted to mention the man who said that to me. Just so you know, this is true. The man who said that to me, today he's still alive, probably in his 90s, and it's understandable why he would be so concerned about doing things a certain way, a proper way. This man had a military career. In fact, many years ago, when Colin Powell was young, this man used to be Colin Powell's superior officer. So, yes, it's understandable why he felt strongly about your appearance being a certain way when you stand up front. But again, friends, sometimes practices can, as mentioned earlier, get to a point where they become rules in our minds, maybe even salvific. And of course, in the case of the Jewish leaders, their traditions, their customs became so important to them. Their purification requirements became so important to them and to the people. They indoctrinated the people to the point where their traditions and rules were treated as they were God's own rules, but they were not. And we can look at this as a case where the Jewish leaders were passing over the weightier matters of the law: judgment, mercy, faith, and the love of God. Let us turn to Mark 7. We'll start with verse 1. We'll now go over the Mark account of the story we read in Matthew. Mark chapter 7, starting with verse 1. Then came together unto him, meaning Jesus, the Pharisees, and certain of the scribes which came from Jerusalem. And when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is to say, with unwashen hands, they found fault. Yeah, interestingly enough, it says on my margin for defiled or common. That is to say, with unwashen hands, they found fault. Remember, common is, they considered the Gentiles, they called the Gentiles common. Verse 3, for the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands oft, eat not, holding the tradition of the elders. Now, in the King James Version, it says, except they wash their hands oft. That's of course, an archaic word for often. My margin says, or diligently. And then it says, in the original, with the fists. Then it says, theophylact, up to the elbow. So, evidently what they had was a ceremonial way of doing the washing before they would eat their food. Let us continue. Verse 4. And when they come from the market, except they wash, they eat not. And many other things there be, which they have received to hold, as the washing of cups and pots, brazen vessels, and of tables. Let's stop there for a minute. Friends, one thing we want to remember about the Pharisees and even the Sadducees, they were not just annoying groups of religious people that other people wanted to avoid, or just people making life miserable for the common people. They were branches of the government in their time. And there was a reason why they had so many requirements. Now, just so keep in mind, friends, I'm of course not agreeing with their requirements. If you go back to the time of Jeremiah, the Israelites were engaged in idolatry, among other things. That was the major issue, idolatry, and practices that came with it. And what was the result? Well, at that time, Israel had been split into two kingdoms, Judah and the northern kingdom, southern kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel. Israel, the northern kingdom, had been invaded by the Assyrians. Then this time, the southern kingdom of Judah got invaded by Babylon. And so, the Jews after the Babylonian captivity, called post-exilian Jews, wanted to avoid those apostasies. They wanted to make sure that they avoided the possibility of those apostasies coming up again. henceforth making more and more of their own rules, having more and more man-made traditions. So let us continue. Mark 7, verse 5. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, "Why walk not thy disciples according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashen hands?" He answered and said unto them, "Well hath Esaias prophesied of you hypocrites, as it is written, This people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, ye hold the tradition of men, as the washing of pots and cups, and many other things, many other such like things ye do." And he said unto them, "Full well ye reject the commandment of God, that ye keep your own tradition. For Moses said, Honor thy father and thy mother, and whoso curseth father or mother, let him die the death." Now, one thing that I find interesting about the Gospel of Mark is Mark gives us an occasional Aramaic word. Remember the title Jesus gave to James and John? The sons of thunder. Mark gives us the Aramaic word, Boanerges. Here he gives us another one. Verse 10. For Moses said, honor thy father. Okay, we'll read that again. Honor thy father and thy mother, and whoso curseth father or mother, let him die the death. But ye say, if a man shall say to his father or mother, it is Corban, that is to say, a gift, by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, he shall be free. And ye suffer him, that means allow him, no more to do aught for his father or his mother. So in other words, the man would be permanently separated from his parents, but he was still permitted to avoid a penalty. Verse 13, making the word of God of none effect through your tradition, which ye have delivered. And many such like things do ye. Verse 14, and when he had called all the people unto him, he said unto them, hearken unto me, every one of you, and understand. There is nothing from without a man that entering into him can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are they that defile the man. If any man have ears to hear, let him hear. Let's stop there just for a moment. I forgot to mention one important part earlier. It was mentioned earlier that, it's mentioned earlier in the chapter that when coming back from the market, people did not eat until they had washed their hands. And why was that? Well, of course, when you go out into the market, went out into the marketplace back then, marketplace back then, you came into contact with a lot of people. And chances are you came into physical contact with Gentiles. That was considered defiling. You were considered ceremonially unclean. So before your meal, you were to wash, as mentioned, with the fist up to the elbow. Continuing, verse 17. And when he was entered into the house from the people, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. And he saith unto them, are ye so without understanding also? Do ye not perceive that whatsoever thing from without entereth into the man, it cannot defile him? Again, we're talking, here in this chapter, we're talking about eating bread with unwashen hands. Continuing, verse 19, but it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the draught, purging all meats. And he said, that which cometh out of the man, that defileth the man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within and defile the man. And I thought I'd recite a chapter. I may have done this before. I thought I'd do this again. A chapter that you're all familiar. A true story. I used to read this chapter once a day in 2005. One day I was in my dorm room at Heartland College thinking about the chapter. And I thought, the words were running through my head, and I thought, do I have this memorized? So I tried to recite it, made a few mistakes. I picked up my Bible, and I read it again, recited it, got it right. And I'll share with you after reciting it the application I want to make to the Jewish leaders. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Charity suffereth long, and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth, but whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass, darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity. Now, I don't know if you know this, but I know the word charity in today's English isn't used to mean love, but its root meaning is love. It comes from the Latin word caritas, which means love for all. And of course, I'm sure you know, many of you, if not all of you, know that the underlying Greek word is agape, which means unconditional love. But Paul mentions the child in that chapter. Why does he mention the child? Well, because children naturally concern themselves with things that are in part, rather than that which is perfect. And the Jewish leaders, the same could be said about the Jewish leaders. They concern themselves with that which was in part, rather than that which was perfect, the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, faith, and the love of God. And so the point I want to make today, friends, is that we want to remember that the same thing can still happen today. It can happen in society. It can happen in church. I don't believe that this church has this problem, but it's a good thing to keep in mind that when things are done a certain way for a long time, in many people's minds, that can become a rule. And it can result in weightier matters being neglected. So, by God's grace, let us always remember the weightier matters of his law, judgment, mercy, faith, and the love of God. May God bless you as you continue your walk with him.